What's up, future shredlords? Welcome back. Death to the Fingers. Looks like we're at the final boss here. Modal chord progressions. Now listen, doesn't make a lot of sense for me just to show you the modal chord progressions because that's pretty straightforward. Instead, about how to then borrow chords from, derived, if you will, from those modal chord progressions to then substitute back into the diatonic key. So now you have these sort of extra flavors, if you will, to play with, where you don't need to sort of have any music theory outside of just following a very simple pattern. And we're going to talk about it. So grab the guitar, get your fingers limbered up, because I'm telling you, this one is killer. Now listen, there's always the element of trial and error involved in these exercises. There is no avoiding it. It's the same with scales and arpeggios. It's basically all of music. You have to be willing to sit down and be like, I have no idea what I'm about to do. Pick a key, in this case, E major, and start to apply these basic principles, whether it's just use the scale to basically flesh out one string and then start building the triads, the chords, if you will, on each scale degree, or then stringing them together using the modal step patterns. Or after that, of course, starting to borrow chords. You're like, okay, well, if I was writing a song that I wanted to sound like in the Phrygian mode, because it's interesting, I want to sound like Yngwie. Well, boom, there you're done, right? But if you're like, I just want to borrow one chord from that entire 7-chord sequence, because this one sounds really killer, and I really like it. So you start writing songs, and you're like, that's a great chord to go to. You see what I'm going at there? It's just basically a great way to discover new ways, applying the same old basic methodology, but coming up with new ideas, which further reinforce, of course, your ear. Every one of these chords in its own way sort of like is like a stepping stone between the previous chord and the next chord, because they usually fall in between. So that's an incredibly important idea in music, that it's like a little Tetris thing where if you do it correctly, you can just keep platforming all the time and just filling in all the gaps. And that's really the quest. So no more for the intro. Let's get into this lesson. All right, step one here obviously has to be set the table. So we're doing E major, so obviously I do it at the 12th fret. Using the classical method, I like to sort of define things vertically when it comes to this kind of stuff. And then horizontally, of course, I use the open string to flesh out each of the scale degrees, right? Which is now going to be associated with a scale name, the Ionian position, the Dorian position, the Phrygian position, this kind of thing. And they obviously line up with the first, second, and third degree of the major scale. So I think you're getting the point here is I'm sort of laying out the grid, right? The slide rule, if you will. And that's necessary so I can keep track of where I am. Otherwise, you're going to find that you get into trouble real quick, right? So, and of course, you want to practice things where you make the least amount of mistakes. Because making mistakes too many times obviously is going to start to ingrain some bad habits. So don't do that. So set the table, set your ear, because at any point in time I could change this from E major to E melodic minor and then reorient the entire system. Or I could switch it over to E harmonic minor and do the same thing. It'd be a new set of triads. It'd be a new set of arpeggios, a new set of scales, obviously. Different scale and chord theory now. So I think you're getting the point here. As soon as I change the entire system from the major scale over to the harmonic minor, the melodic minor, or some other scale system, the Hungarian gypsy minor, whatever, you know, you get fundamental differences. But the principles in and of themselves, building triads, taking every other note in the scale, that stuff stays universal. The sequence of notes, like 1 through 7 or 8 or whatever it is, that stays universal. And all of these other fancy scales are all derived from the major scale. So obviously it's the wellspring from which everything else flows. So that's very important information, but later on, you're going to change this scale system from the major scale to one of the modes, or the minor scale, or the melodic minor, and do this same type of exercise now using chords related to the melodic minor. Now that's much further down the road. There it is. That's what you're working towards. It's just mastering the simple stuff now and then working up to it. But step number one has to be to prepare yourself mentally to be like, I'm working with this. This is the color, and these are the boundaries I'm working with today. And once you start thinking like that, then you can put yourself in the mindset to create ideas that sort of synergize with whatever sort of flavor or color that you're working with. Obviously, when you're in Phrygian, it's going to get this more Middle Eastern flair. When you're doing Lydian, it's going to be more sort of like mysterious. When it's Mixolydian, it's funky and upbeat, sort of jazzy, bluesy, right? When you're into the Aeolian, it's either sad or it can be actually kind of triumphant in its own way, you know, but in a sad way. Obviously, Locrian, you're starting to go off the rails a little bit, but Locrian can actually be very powerful if you get into some really cool scale systems like the half whole tone scale and the whole tone scale stuff, but it's tricky. And of course, the major scale, which is universal, and you've heard trillions of songs based around just that one scale alone. So I think you get the point here is that you have to basically start to understand you got to catalog these things based on each of the scale systems. Oh, there's the major scale, the Ionian mode. Then I have this whole new book of knowledge based around the Dorian mode and the position, and then moving down the chain. And then you have other books like the one on the melodic minor and the one on the harmonic minor. So you open the first page and that's this information right here, the scale broken down on one string so I can lay out the positions. And of course the sound and the sequence of notes. Is it happy? Is it sad? Is it ambiguous sounding? Is it full of tension? What is it? So you can start to prepare yourself mentally to be like, I have to work with this. And then you can basically start to differentiate the subtle little differences that each of the modes and the other scale systems have to offer. If you're not paying attention to the details, you'd be surprised at how much just slips right by the radar. Right, let's get into the next section. All right, we just did the exercise with scales. Now we're doing it with chords, obviously. We're just using the diatonic scale positions laid out on the one string there, the scale degrees. And now we're building the triads, right? So the first degree is going to be major, then minor for the second, minor for the third, major for the 4 and 5, minor for 6, diminished for 7, and major for 1 again. Essentially, this pattern is crucial, so you have to practice it a lot. And then, of course, I just use this little cool guitar hack where I can use the open E in this case because I'm using E major chords, drop the root, and take advantage of the high E and B string, and then just, of course, play this small triad fragment. This is a very, very useful tool. Very useful. And, of course, initially you can do this, and it's kind of predictable, but later on, you'll find yourself doing this. We're just playing the open notes with the triad fragment, and you'll be like, yeah, that was the extra flavor I was looking for there. So this is useful because you're going to do it a lot. But the point being here is that you get a much more interesting sound. It's less predictable. Obviously, when you hear me do it as the big bar chords, it sounds okay, but it gets pretty dense. So this helps you open it up. Of course, you can take it one step further by just targeting certain strings, just playing 3 or 4 notes, usually 3, like a spread triads or something else. Also very useful. You'll see me do that later. Obviously, play the scales, then do the chord sequence. And in this case, it's with respect to the Ionian mode, right? So later on, when you do Dorian, you do the exact same thing. You'd play E Dorian, and then you do the Dorian sequence like this, using the same triad fragments. You'd go from minor to a minor chord, not major minor now. It'd be different. It'd be minor minor, 2 to 3, and then 3 to 4, which would be minor to major, right? And then 4 to 5, another major, 6, minor, diminished. And that gets us into the next section there, where I can start to combine this stuff with the sort of major modes and alter the sequence between the chords and start on different chords and get these modal chord progressions, right? So I'm using the same sort of triad fragments. I want to make that clear, that I'm using right now. All the same ones. All the major ones are the same, all the minor ones are the same, and all the diminished ones are the same for all the future examples. The fact of the matter is I'm now altering the starting position. So in this case, major, I start on major, but in the next instance, I start on minor. So I'm starting with a minor. And since it's the Aeolian position, well, I'm going to move up to diminished as the next position, not Dorian, which is just straight up minor. And there we are. So master the positions, understand the distances, and try to understand the sounds. And then, of course, get it around your head with respect to modalization, where you're going to then start on the second degree and go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2. And then you're going to start at the same spot again. You're going to do it again. Do 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3. I think you get the point here. Then, oh, yeah, starting again. Major for 4. Then move up a whole step, do major for 5, move up another whole step, minor for 6, move up another whole step for diminished, 7, then a half step for the major again. And you can keep going until you get back to the 5th degree or the 4th degree or wherever you started. And that's really the whole point here, is that'll sort of like peel back the onion and you'll get all the flavors and you'll train your ear. Now listen, some sound better than others, obviously, but they're all essential, and you should be doing exercises like this just to break down these sounds. When somebody says, oh, the Locrian mode, you'll have a way different understanding of what that actually means after you do this exercise. Because you'll be like, after I do this sequence of chords, that's what they're talking about, playing in the Locrian mode. You'd start off with the 1st degree there as diminished and then move up to major. And trust me, it's very dissonant. It's awesome, but it's dissonant. So let's get into the next section. All right, there's not much to say about this section. Essentially, in the first one, you saw me use the Ionian position to ascend and descend using these triad fragments. Now I'm using the Aeolian position, right? So obviously, the first big thing to notice is that once you get to the 2nd degree, you can substitute in diminished, right? Because obviously, you're moving from minor to diminished, is 6 to 7. In the first sequence, I'm going 1 to 2. That's major to minor, right? Because the first chord's always major. The second chord's always minor. In the minor sequence, it goes from minor to diminished before I get back to major, right? The 1st degree again. So I'm essentially starting on the 6th degree, then going 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then getting back to 6 again. That's it. That's all I'm doing in this exercise. Now listen, the thing to notice is that 2nd degree can be diminished. That's one of those cool chords I've been talking about that you can then sneak into the diatonic sequence. And you can use that in substitution for another chord or as a transitionary chord. So it's very important to start to sort of understand that these exercises actually, they do have a certain measure of pay dirt, because you'll find these cool chords like this, and there are many more. Trust me, I'm just pointing out the obvious one here. That can be instantly usable. And trust me, diminished is one of the best flavors to just latch onto right away. Most people are afraid of it, but they don't understand how powerful and awesome it can be and essential to sound sophisticated as a musician. So do not be afraid of diminished, which is why I'm showing mostly the diminished ones here. But you get the idea. When I use the Aeolian sequence, now all of a sudden the second degree becomes diminished. So now I can borrow that diminished flavor and superimpose it over top of the Ionian positions one. So go from the major now to diminished before I go to minor. Do you see what I mean? I have either or choice. I can be like, okay, I can either play it as a minor here. I can also do it as a major flavor, incidentally. And of course, now I can do it as diminished. If you know all three, there it is. You have three separate sort of flavors to draw from that you can use in this sequence. So if you are playing something, you could be like, oh, I'm doing this major. I'm going to switch over to the diminished to create tension to jump over to the next chord. That's proper voice leading, right? Or maybe in the other instance, you're like, oh, I'm doing minor. Now I'm going to do diminished before returning back to the root. Okay, so this stuff actually matters in terms of the big picture of music. So practice these ideas here where you start to use the modal sort of step patterns, right? In this case, I did Aeolian, but now say start on Phrygian. So you're going to start with the third degree. Instead of going up a whole step now like you've normally been doing, you're going to go up a half step, 3 to 4, right? And that's got to go from minor to major. And then a whole step up from there and you get another major and you'll be like, okay, now I'm getting these chords, these major triad fragments in between the normal diatonic sequence. And you can start to borrow those ones too to get more even sort of complex and harmonically rich sounds to draw from. And just with this exercise alone, you become infinitely deadly with chords, especially on your own. It's just an infinite source to keep working with, and it only takes about a year to get good enough. It's just organizing your thoughts enough to keep track of each one of the systems, and then, of course, each one of the inversions. So there it is. That's how you basically start doing the modal ones. Let's take a look at the next section there, which is effectively me doing a combination where I do part of one of the modal factions into another one. I think I do actually Mixolydian into the Ionian position. Let's get on it. All right, now that we've basically sort of done the whole modal chord progression idea, the idea here is now to take and do a combination of, because I can do tension and release, right? So in this case, I'm like Mixolydian and Ionian 5 in 1. Those two things, they play very well together. So what if I took those two systems? So they first start off with a major chord. That's good. The 5th degree is major. The 1st degree is major. The 6th degree is minor. The 2nd degree is minor. That's also a bonus. The 3rd degree can either be minor and now diminished. And you're like, okay, the 2nd degree can be diminished and now the 3rd degree can be diminished. Useful information, obviously. So that right there, but when you play the diminished in the 3rd degree there, it gets more of a dominant 7 flavor, right? So if I'd actually played the open B, it would give you that really heavy duty dominant 7 flavor. It'd sound really killer. So that's the point there is you're starting to hear how this information now starts to physically alter your perception about how you can start to string together these chords. You're like, it doesn't have to just go from major to minor to minor to major anymore. It can go from this major to diminished and then jump up to dominant 7 and then boom into major again. Now that's significantly different than what you started with, right? And that's kind of the point here is learning to combine these systems. So in this case, I start off with the Mixolydian system and then I marry it up. By the time I hit the dominant 7, that gives me enough tension to jump back into the diatonic key, which is E major, and just finish off the sequence. In the second example, of course, you hear me spruce it up a bit more, obviously, but I'm now combining most of the chords together. So the second degree is going to be the diminished flavor, and the third degree is now going to be this dominant 7 flavor. And I expand the fourth degree by playing fuller versions of the triads for both the fourth degree and the sixth degree. The fifth degree, I get more, of course, of this diminished flavor again, me substituting in one from the A-type chord family. So that was me just being sneaky. But I think you're getting the point here is essentially after you get the positions laid out for each of the modes by playing these chord sequences, you want to sort of marry up two sections. So in this case, Mixolydian and Ionian. Maybe next time you're going to want to do Aeolian and Dorian. Those two are probably going to go well together, or go from Dorian to Aeolian, whichever one works. And that's just it. Trial and error. If Dorian to Aeolian doesn't work, then try the other two. Flip it around and go the other way. And you'll probably be like, oh, it does work. Okay, there it is. And then you come up with your own rule. You're like, okay, I have to invert these and put them together that way for it to actually work properly. Done. But if there's a will, there's a way. I'm telling you, you can pretty much put these together in any which way you can. But the big takeaway here, of course, is that to marry the two systems up, it's not one thing and the other thing. It's just like you can start to take them and you can parse them up into smaller and smaller pieces. Instead of just having two, you can have 3 movements. You can have 4 or 5. You can keep going until you turn blue in the face, right? So step number 1, play the diatonic sequence just normally using the Ionian mode. Then start working on the modal chord progressions where you're doing Aeolian and then, of course, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, and Locrian. And then at the end, marry up one of the modal ones, in this case, Mixolydian, with the diatonic one that you were working in this case, E major. Bada bing, bada boom, done. And of course, you can also spruce up the chords a little bit. You hear me do that. Change up these sort of triad fragments to use more exotic versions of them with like 9s in them and stuff like that. But that's up to you. Just wanted to show you that that's a possibility, that you can start to mess with these little triad fragments in and of themselves to get these positions to also sound pretty badass. So there's that. Let's get into the free play section and we can wrap this video up. All right, there's the free play. Obviously, you see me factoring in these chords at the second degree diminished, third degree diminished, but sounding more dominant 7. I think I also do it at sharp 5 there, or maybe the 5th degree. I can't remember exactly. I'm doing sort of augmentations. I'm marrying up the systems. On the A string there, I do the C-type chords and the A-type chords in a cool sequence where I also factor in the 3 notes for string stuff. So I think you get the idea here. I'm doing a little bit of everything. I'm thinking about the fretboard in terms of the cage system, but also be like, what's the next note above the one where my first finger here is on the highest string, say the B string. What's the next note above that? Is it a half step or is it a whole step? Now, you either know from 3 notes per string because you can see it in your head, or preferably, you can be like, it's a half step because I can just hear it's that next note up, or it's a whole step. So you're going to start to try to sneak a finger in there, obviously, to, yeah, okay, whatever. Don't even bother commenting on that one, to basically grab that note, right? So, and there it is. Of course, you see me do some other things too, like voice leading. The second to last chord, I throw in that upper note there, which sounds a little out of place until I hit the last chord, right? Again, a great sort of use there, in my opinion, at least, of some old classical stuff, right? So that one note, it's just real obtuse, like, you know, it's ostentatious. So you got to really sort of, but of course, once you hit that last sort of chord with the upper extension there, it moving up that half step, it just makes it all the more worthwhile, right? So it really brings a level of finality to your tune, and that's important. It creates dramaticism. It actually gives you a tool. It's not just about notes anymore. It's about the arrangement of notes and how you think. You're like, go from this chord, but play a note slightly higher so that I can go down and up at the same time. And it creates this sort of like widening effect in terms of the chord, but also gives it the sense of sort of resolution and makes it sound very juicy indeed, obviously. So when we all start out doing the free play thing, nobody does a very good job of it. Like I said, I couldn't do that a year ago. I was terrible. My triad game was absolutely laughable. And then I watched a whole bunch of Rick Graham videos and he shamed me brutally. And I was like, you know, it's the beginning stuff. It's the early stuff. The triads, that's the problem. I'm not very good at it. I don't know what they are. Right? Like anybody else. And so then I started to jump on it. And there it is. This is a year's worth of work. So, you know, once you start to get on the triads, you're like, well, it doesn't end there. All of a sudden you can use the modalization of these triads and the step pattern that they created from that modalization to effectively rearrange the sequence. Now you can get other triads that you can borrow and incorporate back into the parent scale, in this case, E major, right? But it's true for all of them. In your mind, you're thinking the first degree, it starts off as major. But when I get to the second degree, I can either play major, or sorry, I can either, nice, yes, I could do major. No, you're going to do major at the first degree, of course, minor or diminished at the second degree. And of course, dominant 7 is in there too. If you think about the arpeggios, you can do a D7 there too. So there it is. You have 3 choices now for Dorian. You have probably 3 choices at Phrygian, which of course is going to be minor and the dominant 7 flavor. And of course, you're going to get diminished in there because you can basically play diminished everywhere. And that's the whole point. You start to recognize that this one position here can take on many different colors. And based on what you're reacting to, that's where the real magic happens. Do you know when to use diminished? Do you know when to use the dominant 7? And once you start thinking in terms of that, to be like, recognize this sound and then marry it up with what it is that you're hearing or what the chord was before or after what you just played in a free play situation, right? Do you like, do I go to diminished here or do I go to dominant 7? You know, do I go to this chord or do I go to that chord? What's the next one in the sequence? Do I want to do a cadence or do I want to continue doing this sort of stepwise motion using the diatonic system? Cadence meaning a leap. You're going to go do like some sort of interval, like a third or a fifth or whatever it is. And there it is, right? You're actually starting to plan in your mind what actually transpires with respect to these chords, just like you're going to plan in your mind what goes on when you're doing melodies and improvisations with scales and arpeggios. It's just like anything else. You have to be the architect. So that's the end of the video. There it is. When it comes to the free play stuff, it's just you starting to work up the courage, really, just to be like, I got to start to factor this stuff in there. Just play a big, fat, juicy open E chord, play a small scale fragment, and try to get to another chord. And be like, what happens when I substitute in the 3? So B minor, if you're playing G major, or the 3 in the case of E major is going to be G sharp minor, right? Or what happens when I do G sharp diminished? Or what happens if I do the F sharp 7, right? Or the variation of the 5 chord in this case, which would be A7 based off the F sharp there, right? So again, the whole point that I'm trying to make here is that you don't actually start to practice these things until you recognize that you can. And then, of course, you take an active interest in actually bringing these influences into your practice sessions and using them. And I would start by just booking a whole section aside, a whole session, if you will, with respect to just working on chords. And once you do that, I think that you'll be like, chords aren't nearly as scary as I thought it was. And instead, it's this incredibly powerful and useful tool that will absolutely set you free with respect to fretboard knowledge and ability to create music. Without the chord stuff, you're kind of up the creek. And so you have no choice but to practice it. And of course, afterwards, besides just factoring in these new borrowed chords, you can also manipulate the original ones from a major triad to major 7 or major 9 or something like that, like you see me do, obviously. And of course, factoring in those 3 notes per string and classical method notes, basically the melody notes, to really either just play an extra note added to create a little sort of, a little something extra with the chord itself, or an actual melody fragment to get to the next chord section. So again, all of these things are skills that you have to practice in a free play session and can't be overlooked. You have to be able to connect a scale and 2 chords together. It's not as easy as you think to make it sound believable in that kind of a situation. I actually had to do quite a few takes just because I kept screwing up the scale. The chords were fine, but when I tried to do the chords and the scale together at the very beginning, my brain was like, nah, whatever, get lost. Okay, so there it is. End of the video. I wish you all the best on the chords thing. We're getting into some pentatonic stuff in the next lesson. Of course we are. And of course, as always, I appreciate every single one of you. Thanks for hanging out with me. We'll see you in the next one.